Hey there, and welcome back to talking about Maya. That was Maya. That was Maya. We're still in the Mash tutorial series thing, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more fun. We're going to go over transformation, replicator, and random nodes today. So strap in. This is going to be all in mesh networks, just because I don't want to deal with insters anymore. So let's get to it. First things first, I'm going to create a platonic solid and I'm gonna make it like a D10. D10, something like that. We're gonna use this guy. It's like a soccer ball. I think it's gonna be fun. First things first, I do want to bevel it just for funsies. We'll go into an extra segment. We'll take this fraction and keep it kind of like that. So it's gonna catch the light, get some facets. We'll get a little sharper there. No, we won't. We'll make it a little less sharp actually. So we've got our basic object. We're then going to smooth it out to get some geometry to work with. We're going to go to 2 on this guy. So we'll scale him right up, right about there. And what are we going to do? We're going to make a mesh network. What are we going to make it out of? Other dice. So we're going to duplicate. No, we're not. We're just going to make another one. And this is going to be a D20. But we will put it into edge mode and bevel its edges as well. We're going to add another segment there, fractionalize it to a fairly sharp point. We're going to leave it as is so that the number of polygons is diminished. So let's go ahead and create a mesh network out of this dude. I want to make sure that this is a mesh. Perfect. So we're going to call this dice on dice action. I don't know why I'm starting to have more and more descriptive titles, but here we are. We're going to go to our mesh editor. Don't need to click that, but felt like it. What are you going to do? We're going to go to mesh. I think we're going to go with a random face center. Drag our platonic one into the input mesh. So you can see now it's starting to have some growths on it. Oh no, there's many growths now. Let's go ahead and put on 200. Starting to see some interesting effects. They're grouping along these really dense mesh lines, which I think is pretty interesting. And yeah, I think we're going to go over a couple of ways to use the transform node now. So, opening up our waiter again, we'll go down here and create a transform node. We have a couple things we can do with this. We can enter in some numbers willy-nilly and hope that they work. That was way too many. You can see we can keep it going up. We can go to along the z-axis in a direction, but I mean, who really works like that, right? So what you really want to do is one of two things. You can either create a controller for it, or you can use another object to control its transformation. So I want to go over that second option second. So if you right click in this controller node, you can create. And what you get is this locator. If we isolate it, it's kind of at the origin point. So if you've got your mesh network offset for somehow, some reason, like you move to repro mesh, it's going to be relative to your locator. So when we move our locator, our mesh network travels with it. If we move our repro mesh, nothing happens. So that's the main reason we even create one in the first place. One thing you can do if you're moving other objects, you can just parent this locator to the object, and it'll just move around with it. It should rotate with it as well. I didn't mention that, but assuming everything goes well, you should be able to rotate with it as well. Yeah. So you can rotate the mesh network independent of the object it's being attached to even, which can be useful. I don't know how often you would want to do that, but the option is open to you. If, however, you want this to translate with your object, it sort of already does that by default when you're using a mesh distribution. But let's assume that you're doing a volume distribution for whatever reason, right? And you've got a cube, and you make it large, and you want it to translate with your dice, right? For whatever reason. One thing you can do is go to your transform node with your object selected, right click and click connect. Whoa. And a couple things happen, apparently. If you scale your points, it automatically resizes them to the same size as your controlled object, or as your controlling object. If you deselect it, they retain their original size relative to your object. I was not expecting that. So you can now, I think this volume size is now relative to the size of your object. By the feel of it, that seems to be the case. And when you move your object, your field of little dice goes along with it. Pretty handy. We're going to stick with that for the rest of the tutorial, I believe. Though I haven't thought that far ahead, honestly. And go back and create a random node. And we're going to do that because right now these are all very regular, very boring. They're kind of sporadically placed because of their volume method, but I mean, other than that, it's kind of dull. Spice it up with some random, and not much happens. The only things by default that are turned on are position X, Y, and Z have an extra unit of translational randomness. We're actually going to turn that off for now to make this rotational randomness much more apparent. I'm going to give them all a 360-degree random number so that they have the ability to randomly be fully turned in any of these axes one time. So you'll notice that they're all sort of pseudo-randomly turned, which is fantastic. I'm also going to do a 0.5 scaling possibility for randomness, so they all sort of can be oblongy, they can be perfectly round, they can be anything in between. And now, since the scaling of everything is kind of weird, let's go ahead and add in a 10 positional randomness so that they can be fairly well scattered around this guy. One thing I'm curious about is if you rotate your original object, do the objects rotate with you? And the answer is yes, sort of. That is interesting. I believe it's distribution type to distribution type, but it appears with a volume and randomness on that. It does some very interesting effects. If we turn off the random node, yeah, the cube comes with us normally. However, when we turn random on, random is being applied dynamically as these objects are being placed through space. So when you rotate their local space, their randomness changes in a predictable way because they all are based off of the same seed. It's just, you can end up with a really cool animation of like a pulsating little field of work here. So just just let it be known, the more nodes you get, the more they start to act upon each other. So that's why when we rotate like this, it stays static. You can kind of understand the movement, and as soon as you apply random, it's sort of propagating the randomness over time. It's kind of interesting, actually. So we're gonna leave that alone for now, but you can scale it, and it will scale the positional space with them. They look bigger when they're close together. As you spread them apart, they're still the same actual size, but they appear smaller. So, unless of course you turn on the scaling points, in which case they do actually get smaller with you, but they do not change spatially. So that is a very interesting little effect. Yeah. Moving on, we're gonna work with Replicator now. Not exactly useful in this scenario, so we're gonna turn this off. And we're going to use our platonics to make a second mesh network. We're going to create a replicator mesh. And how do we want to do this? I think we are going to distribute them in a volume of spheres. Increase the volume size by a substantial amount. Put the spherical bias sort of towards the center and up the number of these to, say, 200. Okay, so we've got this kind of sparse area. Let's go ahead and add a random node. We'll turn these all up to 10. All these rotations will be 360 as before. Scales will be left alone. We're going to keep these guys nice and normal. Looks good. Okay, so going back to our replicator mesh, we're going to now add a replicator node. As a side note, probably not my smartest decision to name the entire mesh network after a node. In the future, I will not be doing that. It just confuses things. Because now when we create the replicator node, we've got replicator, mesh, replicator, and it's just poor practice. Poor practice. Do not be me. So when you create a replication node, it does nothing by default. You'll see we have 0 replicants. So if we start increasing that, you'll see this kind of light speed Star Wars effect, right? And if we go down to our... Oh, we don't have one. Oh, there we go. Yeah. If we go to our position ramp, we can actually bias it one way or the other. So let's say you've got smooth there, get a smooth here, and we'll get a smooth here. Okay, fine. Splines. We'll do splines. This is one of the few things I really don't like about the mesh network is that it really is tedious to work with the ramps. So if we get this kind of shape, you can get this sort of elongated speeding up effect, visually speeding up over time. If, however, you decide that you don't want just a z axis of translation for replicators, you can also work on its other axes, and it will still all be based off the position ramp. So this works very similarly to the distribution node in that you are sort of defining the distance it's replicating them over, but weirdly and very differently, the higher the number of replicants you add, the further it's actually going to travel, which is in stark contrast to the distribution node. In distribution, when you tell it how far you want it to, how large of a shape you want it to be, how far in space you want it to go, if you're doing like a linear sort of situation, it then fills in the gaps between those 2 points, between the starting origin point and between the ending distribution point. But in a replicator, it's very different. It seems to be that each iteration of the replication is offset by 2 units in the z direction. And if you increase this to 4, suddenly each iteration is now 4 units apart. And of course, we're working with a ramp here, so it's not quite that clear cut. But if we were to put this back to normal, you would see that these are now basically 4 units apart, give or take some easing. And if we add more units, or if we take units away, down to, say, close to 13, the actual space traveled goes down because each replication is spaced, 4 units after the other one. So you can expect it to go out to about here-ish. So the spacing remains constant between replications, not the space that the replications are being placed in. It's kind of a weird and nuanced difference, but it really causes issues if you don't understand the difference between them. So I figured I would take a little time to really go over it and try to make sure that everyone is very clear on that. The other interesting side effect of replicator nodes is if you start adding a second random node, things get a little wonky. The order of these nodes is actually quite important. You see here, if you have 2 random nodes on top of each other over the distribution node, they both apply downwards, so that the distribution node is basically extra random. Like it could be doubling the effects of this node, and you'd never even know it. However, if you want this random to affect the replicator, you need to put it above the replicator node, or more precisely, put the replicator below the random node, because that's how Mash likes to work. And now you see that the positions of the replications are all wonky and weird and bulbous and cool and icically and all kinds of other adjective words. So the order that you place certain nodes in relation to other certain nodes matters greatly. Specifically, the only ones I've been able to figure out are random and replicator, or random and curve, or random has a big effect on it. Um, I think the best way to think about this is that the order of operations, order of execution is top to bottom. Or maybe I don't like that. So it originally distributes your objects. It then randomizes that distribution. It then replicates that entire distribution and randomness, and then you can randomize that replication of those things. So it can become quite confusing fast. Um, so beware, beware the pink elephant stare. So yeah, if we go to random here, we can. I think we can actually play with some of these settings in relation to the replicators, but they don't actually like rotate the replications like based on an origin point. They, I think it looks like um, it looks like they rotate the replications objects, so it sort of affects each individually in addressable mesh item with randomness of rotation, which of course is at odds with. Well, maybe not. I don't know. But you can do some crazy things with this. So let that be known. Yeah, order of operations matters, and random is awesome. Random is how you get these really cool placement effects very quickly, very intuitively, and is very difficult for humans to make it very random. So it's hugely appreciated that all these things work the way they do. And of course, if you rotate the oh, we didn't do that. Let's do that. Let's add a transformation node. Let's grab our item in here, go back to our transform, and connect it. You notice it has a scaling. Undo that. It goes back to this. Uh, it's quite far spread now. It's actually sort of like an asteroid field. And you can rotate that asteroid field, but it does do weird effects. Like, for some reason, now it is still densely populated up here, but it's way more spread out. It is very interesting. The way that these nodes interact is honestly quite confusing at times. And how interesting is that? The transform node does matter where you place it. Now it's basically not affecting the replication node. So if you put this at the very top, yeah, very top, suddenly the replications are being affected by the translations in whatever way that Mash decides that that works. Some of these things feel kind of mysterious. We're gonna go ahead and turn off that. Is there anything else I want to cover on this one? Well, that's it. Yep. So we're starting to build up this really strong sense of objects in Maya. If you were to take an Arnold render of this, let's say you grab this repro mesh, assign your AI standard surface, and give it like a copper look, right? Hide this original shape here just because it's no longer useful for this particular example. And let's get an Arnold render view going so we can kind of quickly need to get that light in. Let's get a physical sky going here. And let's just kind of position it so that it's fairly in your face. with this sky shader, I always like to put in more samples. And I think we're going to ignore specular and the Arnold renderer just to save on render time. And we'll take a quick look at this. Oh, but that covers pretty much everything this round. Oh, come on. Always forget to set this to 1080. So while this is rendering, just kind of go over some details of the curve node. The not the curve node. Apologies. The replicator node behaves very differently than the distribution node. Um, they're both very similar, but remember that offset is very different than the distance attribute. So keep that in mind. Do your best with that. It can be infuriating. So just be aware of that. The order of placement matters a lot. So a random node above a replicator affects the replicator as well, but a random node below it doubles down on the distribution. Yeah, it's probably the quick and dirty way of talking about that. Lastly, the transform node, you can either create a null controller for it, not a null controller. You can either create a locator that controls the transformations independently of an object, or you can take a mesh object and use its transform as the controlling transformation for the entire network. So, depending on the project you want to do, um, you know, I think that's going to be what determines which way you want to go with the transform. So, yep, that was pretty much the three nodes we went over today, and this is the render we came out with. Kind of interesting. I think we might use a new material next video. Not super satisfied with the composition on that, but gets the job done. Bing, bang, boom. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you on the next video. Bye bye.